Hello, and welcome to JordanCONline, podcast edition. I am Richard Fife, director of the Writers Track, and this is The Writing Process with Faith Hunter and David Coe. Also joining me will be my assistant director, Robby Hilliard. Let's hear introductions from our panelists and my co-moderator. Robby, do you want to start?
Sure. Robby Hilliard, working with Richard for several years now at multiple conventions. And I've also worked with our guests, Faith and David, various conventions on writing tracks and things like that. So,
thank you, Robby. Faith, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Faith Hunter. I write books under a bunch of different names. I was going to be guest of honor this year. The universe decided otherwise, and I'm very grateful to the con for saying I didn't have to come there and get sick and kill everybody. So, yay, con!
And David.
Hi, I am David B. Coe. I also write as D.B. Jackson. I write fantasy and historical fantasy and urban fantasy and some media stuff. I have known Richard and Robby for many, many years. Faith and I have known each other and worked together and been very good friends now for 13 years. And I'm glad to be here. I have been to JordanCon several times. I'm a former guest of honor. I miss it this year. I'm sad that we're not going to get to go. Plus, I'm supposed to see Hamilton tonight in Atlanta, and I'm kind of salty that I'm not getting to see that either.
So the topic of this panel is the writing process. And so Faith, could you just tell us, if you want to start, how does your writing process begin?
The writing process is different for every project. For instance, when I am writing a standalone, I have to start with the basic premise of character and conflict. I have a character who has some weaknesses and some strengths, and I have a conflict that challenges those weaknesses. So those are generally notes, very short notes, and then I'll start writing to get the voice, so I have the character in my head. And then I sit down and I do, after about maybe 10 or 15 pages, I'll do a complete outline where I bring all of the concept of voice and point of view and character strengths and weaknesses and the conflict together, and I write out how the conflict gets worse, harder, and more difficult on the character, and how the character eventually grows enough to solve the conflict. So that's a standalone. But when I'm working on a full-length novel that the world is already built, the character's already built, I skip all that early stuff and I go directly into the conflict and character. So it goes almost directly into the outline process. I don't have to put any words on paper from the character's point of view. I don't have to think much about character. I have to go back and read the end of the previous book to make sure I haven't left stuff out. And I'm just able to dive right into an outline process. And then there's the audio stuff that I've been doing. No outline at all for the first time in my life. I have pantsed it from the get-go. It's been an absolutely freeing, wonderful, fantastic experience because I'm not tied down to anything. And I've only got 40,000 to 50,000 words to worry about. And if I mess up, I can go back and fix it and not worry about being 120,000 words in and go, oops. So that process is always different for the type of project that I'm working on. And it can either be beneficial to follow an old established way or beneficial to try something new.
David, how's your process overview look?
Yeah, I would re-emphasize everything that Faith just said about how the process changes from project to project, even within a series. You can have 5 books in a series, and each one will come about and develop in different ways. Right now, I am working on a new Thief Taker novella. And the Thief Taker books, because they're historical fiction in addition to fantasy and mysteries and all of that, they have a kind of, at least in my experience, a unique process, because I need to find historical events around which to build a story. So, for instance, the last Thief Taker book that I wrote left off at the Boston Massacre, which was 1770, March. And so I started looking for, okay, what happened in Boston later in 1770? Well, there were the trials of the people who were responsible for the Boston Massacre. And at the same time, it turns out, there was a once-in-a-century storm that flooded Boston 4 days before the trial actually began. And okay, well, there you go. That is enough for me to build 5 Thief Taker stories right there, because you can use magic to explain the storm, and you've got a built-in conflict because obviously different people going into those trials have different agendas, and my lead character is going to be caught in the middle of them. And so once I have started building the historical framework for the storytelling I'm going to do, then I get to bring in my characters and figure out, how does Ethan fit in? Ethan is my hero in the Thief Taker books. How does he fit into this narrative? How does his nemesis, Sapphira Price, who is a rival thief taker, how does she fit in? What do Samuel Adams and John Adams and Josiah Quincy and some of the other Sons of Liberty want? And what do the Loyalists want? And it's very similar to what Faith is talking about. It's figuring out your characters, figuring out their desires and their fears and the things that are going to hold them back and the things that they want to accomplish. And from there, it's just dive in and start playing and see what develops. And at this point, I'm coming up on 20,000 words. It's going to be probably 35,000 words, this first novella. And then I have 2 more novellas planned following this one. But that's, that's the process for this project. You could ask me about a different project and my process would look totally different.
All right, so, and this is a question for both of you, just thinking on the topic of writing process. Are you guys, are you like an anywhere, anytime kind of writer, or do you tend to work with a set schedule, time of the day, a specific place to write? I realize you guys travel a lot, but generally speaking, do you try to have a set aside of space at home or anything like that? And
I'll go ahead and take this one first. I am very much a creature of habit. I know a lot of writers who like to go to different places. They'll find a coffee house or something and write there. They'll go to different parts of their house for different moods and stuff. I have an office in our house. My wife and I built this house, built it. We designed it and we hired people who had skills to build it. But we built this house some 21 years ago, and I was just at the start of my career then, and we built this gorgeous office that has a whole side of bookshelves, and I have all my reference material and everything, and a big computer, and I come in every morning after usually going to the gym, or recently because of social distancing, going on a hike, and I sit down and I work normal business hours and try to get a certain amount done each day, usually determined by a word count that I'm after. And then when Nancy gets home from work, I knock off. Sometimes I'll do a little more work in the evening after dinner, but I try to keep it as much like a regular job as I can so that I can enjoy my family time and my personal time. But I have to be in my office, I have to be at my desk, and I have to be working at the same hours each day. That routine really helps me start and stop my creative process each day.
I am very much like David in the sense that I have a desk with a computer with multiple screens, and I have different files up on different screens. And when I get up in the morning, I come downstairs, make a pot of tea, turn on the computer, and sit down every morning. Now, mind you, while I'm doing the pot of tea, I am also texting Mama to make sure she's okay, and texting family to make sure everybody made it through the storm. This morning was one solid batch of post-storm texting, because as we are doing this cast, we're all getting through this horrible storm. So this morning, instead of 30 minutes worth of checking on family, it was like 4 hours. But I always sit right down, and the first thing I do in the morning is I do the business. I do Facebook with all of the pages on that. I'll check Twitter if I'm in the mood, and it's all business. My brain doesn't want to be creative first thing. And as soon as I'm finished with the business, I dive into writing. The outline is up on one screen, and the text is up on the other, because I'm writing Jane Yellow Rock, so I'm using a full outline, very detailed. And it is a number of hours of work until I get up from my chair and fix lunch, and then I go back to work. And unlike David, I do my exercise in the afternoon. So at the end of my writing time, I will call the hubs and say, you want a yoga, or do you want to go for a walk around the block, or whatever we decide to do that day. And sadly, all of the rivers are closed, so nothing of my fun time is in a kayak at this point. But hopefully that will change, because normally at this time of year, at least 2 days a week, I've got 4 hours on a river, or at the Whitewater Center in Charlotte, or something that gets my mind away from the writing. But like David, I do have that word count that I try to do every day. And if I'm not successful, I have to knock it over into the next day. So for instance, this morning, I didn't get my word count in. So I'll be working later tonight than normally, and I will be punching it harder tomorrow to get that word count caught up. I've got a deadline I've already missed once due to health issues, so I can't miss it again.
Yeah, I would add two things to that. One is during the pandemic, my word count goal has dropped a little more precipitously than the stock market. I usually shoot for 2,500 words a day, and I am currently only capable of about 1,700 words a day. I am too distracted, too kind of uptight and fearful, and thinking about my kids and thinking about my wife, and it's just I'm not as productive as I normally am. And then the other thing I would say is I would factor into my workday the fact that Faith and I usually chat at least once a week by phone and send each other snarky messages almost daily. And so, I could probably get more words written, but Faith really prevents that. And I think it's just that she's out to sabotage my career.
Yes,
but you know,
that's absolutely true.
but seriously, I know that you're giving Faith a little bit of a hard time there, but on a little more serious approach to that, how important is interaction with other writers, with other creative minds in your overall sort of process? Not necessarily per project, but just sort of keeping that sanity, sort of bouncing ideas, or just feeling that you're communicating with a kindred creative. How much of a role does that play for both of you in your creative lives?
In my case, it doesn't have anything to do with David's creativity, because it's so easy to knock off the track. What I need is, yeah, I hear you. What I need is the snark. I need somebody who sort of thinks like I do, and can come back with a comment that takes me out of whatever place I'm in. And David's right. Ever since the pandemic started, it's at least every other day I'll text or he'll text, y'all okay? Everybody well? And then we'll do additional texting, or we'll call and how are things going? Did you know so-and-so's father is sick? Or did you know so-and-so's father-in-law or sister or somebody is sick? And we keep up with I'm not going to use the term our tribe. We keep up with our friends in the writing world by this chat that we have almost every day, and it's like talking to my brother. I am completely comfortable with what I say to David, and I know that if I've got an issue, I can talk to him about it and he can talk back. And that's this friendship that we have is one of the great things that's carrying me through the pandemic. It really is. It makes me laugh. It makes me comfortable, and we don't really talk about writing, except I did know that David's word count had plummeted while mine has gone through the roof. So nah.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, all of that is true, and yet there are times when we really do talk about writing, where one of us will say to the other, look, I'm struggling with this, I'm halfway through a chapter and it's going nowhere, can I send it to you, will you look at it and tell me what I've done that needs work? Or Faith will call me with a question about birds of prey, because I'm a big bird watcher and I know tons about birds, or I will call her with a unique injury because she used to do ER work and worked in a medical lab and she knows all the medical stuff. And so I can say, okay, if I do this to my character in 18th century Boston, have I killed him or cost him a limb, or can he recover from this? And so our friendship, which is tons of fun and often, as she says, never does touch on the writing, is also an invaluable writing resource when we need it. And I'm sorry, I was just going to say, and what Faith said before about our other writing friends, and you guys know a lot of them, you know, John Hartness and A.J. Hartley and Misty Massey and so many others who I'm forgetting and who you know, we would name in a heartbeat if we weren't old and losing brain cells by the day. But this is one of the reasons, I mean, this is one of the small but significant side effects of the pandemic is we don't get to come to JordanCon. We might not get to go to other conventions that we have signed on for. And those conventions are more than chances to interact with friends. They are opportunities to recharge and think creatively with our fellow creators about what makes the process work and just talk through issues that we as writers are all dealing with right now.
And I will say that not only do we occasionally throw ideas against the walls of each other's brains and see where the spaghetti sticks, we also talk about the business. And that's changing so rapidly. I'll send a text to David and say, I need to talk about something that I heard on the radio or on Facebook, radio. And see how old I am? That I saw on Facebook. Yeah, that I saw on Facebook, and I want your take on it. And he'll pull it up and he'll read it, and then we'll chat and we'll talk about what's happened with a certain company. Maybe there have been layoffs, or maybe there have been changes in contracts, or maybe there have been loss of change in boilerplate, loss of income, or maybe a company's going out of business. And all of these things that we catch up on normally at JordanCon, and we are sharing this information. We don't have that this year. I mean, we don't have any cons anymore this year. I'm truly afraid. So what we have is, we have Facebook, and we have internet, and we have phone calls, and we have texts, and we do the business part that we would normally do in the bar at JordanCon after 2 or 3, or depending on, you know, who all's at the table, sometimes many more drinks, and we're talking the business of writing. And so we don't have that now. We don't have that this year. And that's a huge, huge loss, because especially at Jordan, you've got that fabulous place downstairs at the bar where everybody can sit in small groups and talk, and other people can come and go. And and the conversation can ebb and flow, and we don't have it. And I'm going to cry.
Yeah, it's part of the process as well. The creative process is lonely at times, but it's also interactive. And at its best, we have that opportunity for interaction periodically throughout our professional year. And our calendar is dotted with events that keep us grounded and keep us in touch with other writers and with our fans. And this year, it's odd and it's different and it's difficult. And this is one of the reasons why I'm struggling. Faith obviously doesn't need people, and that's fine. She can write as much as she wants without people.
Well, now, to be fair to me,
why would we do that?
Why start now? I know. But writing was when I was a child. I had a lot of emotional issues and some mental health issues that in today's day and age, I would have been on medication for and would have seen counselors for, and I would have dealt with things. But back then, kids didn't have mental issues. And so they didn't have counselors in schools, and they didn't have people to talk to. And so I did my stories, and that kept me sane. So for me, writing is my big bottle of wine. Yeah. When things are bad, I dive into my stories, and my output goes way up because things are bad. And I'm pushing hard to get 1,700 words a day, which is David's minimum. And these days, I'm pushing 2,000 to 2,500 words a day. So I'm doing great because this is my drug. And I know that about myself. As soon as things straighten out, my output will plummet. Because everything's okay, and I don't have to hide from the world in this other world that I have created. And so, yeah, I'm making out like a bandit. So there, and I'll go, na, 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 na.
Yeah. So slightly different tack, and hopefully getting away from lamenting the conless year. What is something in your process that you've kind of figured out through the years that kind of looking back, it's like, oh, wow, that would have made things so much easier if I did it this way, or it's kind of something that you didn't initially do when you were starting out writing that you've kind of become to really rely on?
For me, that would circle back to something we started talking about early in this conversation, which is the notion that every project is different and demands a different approach and creates different creative exigencies. I tried early in my career to come up with a creative process that I could impose upon every project I wanted to write. And some projects were amenable to it, and some, it sounds like they have a mind of their own, and actually they do. Some of the projects rebelled against that attempt to kind of impose someone else's structure upon it. And I struggled far more with certain books than I needed to, because I thought, well, if I'm not doing it the way I did A, B, and C, then I'm doing it wrong. And so understanding, kind of accepting that I have the freedom to approach each project on its own terms is something that took me a long time to understand.
Can you give us a specific example?
There was a book in the third series I wrote, the middle book of Blood of the Southlands, that just I could not figure out how to get going on it. The book ended up fine. I actually think it's I like the book a lot, but I simply could not come up with how to write the book. And the reason was I had decided that I was an outliner, and I always started with an outline. And that book, for some reason in particular, didn't want to be outlined. It wanted to be pantsed. And I resisted that and resisted that and resisted that, and kind of forced myself to create an outline that, of course, became irrelevant by like the end of chapter 3 or something ridiculous like that. And so I wasted a bunch of time making myself impose order on a specific creative process that for that book defied the need for order. if that makes sense.
Yeah. Faith?
Well, when I first started writing, I didn't understand that I didn't have all of the tools I needed in my toolbox. And what I lacked most was the ability to plot and conflict. It was, to me, it should be a linear process. But my brain at that point of my life was not linear. My brain was all over the place and chaotic. And so trying to outline, like all of the books that I was reading said to outline, wasn't working for me. So I had never heard of what I did. I have made it up myself, but it's a well-known process now, which is to make bubble outlines or grape outlines. So what I did was I went to the local drugstore and I bought 4 big pieces of poster paper and I laid them out in the middle of my living room. And I put the character's name, put a big circle in the middle, and I put the character's name and the basic conflict in the middle. And then I started drawing out to the side a line with a circle, and that might be another important character. And then I would draw a line out in a different direction, and that would be the antagonist. And then I would draw a line that combined, that touched the antagonist and the protagonist together, and that line was how the conflict affected them. And I went through 4 full poster boards before I understood how my brain was working. And then I had to figure out how to make it linear, because I had it all over these non-linear methodology. And so I would go through and I would start numbering them, and it would end up like, so that I could put them on, type them in and make them linear so that I could follow them for my book. And so it would be 1, 2, 3A, 3B, 3C. Oh, here's 2B, and here's 2-4, and oh, okay, here's 6. Now where's 5? Okay, 5 is way over here, and they would each have a number, and I would be able to go back and then follow the numbers and get them into a linear format. And once I did that for about, 6, 8 books, I was able to only go back to that, those bubble outlines or grape outlines or whatever they're calling them these days, and when I was having a problem. So if I suddenly realized that I'd lost track of what this book is about, or my conflict was suddenly just at a standstill, then I could go back and I could start fresh and do a bubble outline from that point and figure out where I had lost myself. I guess it's probably been 10 years since I've done, I can tell you exactly when. The last time I had a problem was the first Jane Yellow Rock book. And I sat down with a piece of poster board and scribbled out the potential of an outline, and it all came clear, because the most important thing for me is the conflict and the character, and I just had to find where the character, where I could make the character suffer enough to make the book worthwhile.
Let's see. So it sounds like both of you are saying to us is that you've had to discover sort of your own unique way to approach things, and it can be, as you both said, it's sort of different for each different project that you're working on. With that in mind, how important do you think it is for beginning writers to have some understanding of things, just like at the basic level of like story structure, in classic, plotting, 3 acts, 4 acts, whatever approach they want to take, whether they adhere to that or not? But how important do you think it is to to have an understanding of those kinds of things?
I feel like every writer needs to understand that the purpose of any writing project is not to talk about a thematic issue, not to talk about their political viewpoint. Those things can be a part of the background of a novel, but they have to start with that conflict. And that conflict has to get worse and worse and worse throughout the book. They can't go 40 pages with nothing happening that matters to the plot or the main characters. So for me, I always tell people, if you don't understand the 3-act process, then just understand that every 10 pages, it can be less, but it shouldn't be more. Something important needs to happen to your character, or your character needs to learn something that will help in the solving of the conflict. So if you have this 10-page rule in your mind, you can push things through, and you'll realize, okay, I've been 20 pages. Nothing has happened. Let me go back and make things worse. And for me, that rule of thumb was helpful, because that let me, as a young writer, understand how the 3 acts worked, was by making sure that something important happened all the time, and that it was important to the character and the conflict, not to some message I was trying to share, not for some lesson I wanted to teach, but important to that character, important to that conflict, because reading is supposed to be an immersive experience. When we read or listen to a novel on audio, we're supposed to fall into it. It's supposed to grab us up and our everyday real life disappear, so that we're inside this other world, this other story, this other character. And I think I went slightly away from your question, but I think that's, to me, that's the most important thing. The only way you keep your readers involved is to keep the suffering high, and the solution not completely out of reach, but so far out of reach that they don't want to put the book down.
Yeah.
I would add to that, and I'm sure Faith would agree with this, just as we all come to our creative process by project and by our own, practices uniquely, each one of us has his or her own approach. Each person comes to the beginning of their career, their desire to be a creative writer, from a different place. I came to this profession from being a professional historian. I have a PhD in history, and I had finished a dissertation and was looking at being a history professor and history teacher. I didn't have formal training in creative writing. If someone had asked me to articulate the 3-act structure when I started writing my first novel, I would have stumbled around and eventually gotten to it maybe, but really I wouldn't have had any idea what the hell I was talking about. But I had read extensively in our genre and outside our genre, but I had read a ton of fiction. I was a movie buff. I was constantly absorbing creative content and storytelling. And so I had an intuitive sense of what the 3-act structure was, of what the hero's journey was supposed to look like, of what character arc and story arc were supposed to feel like when readers experience them. And so I was able to put together a book in a way that worked in all those important ways, even though I didn't have the formal training that some other writers might have had. Now, the second thing I would say is I benefited from having a really good developmental editor at the beginning of my career who was able to say to me, okay, you've got the idea of what story is supposed to look like, but here is what you need to do to refine your skills because you're not there yet. You are good, but you could be so much better, and here's what we can do to make you better. And my learning curve on those first several novels was incredibly steep because I was taking that raw knowledge I had from my own consumption of creativity and turning it into practice with the help of someone who really knew what he was doing and who understood what I was trying to do. And so I would say, yeah, you need to understand those things, but that doesn't mean you need to get an MFA. It doesn't mean you need to read every book about writing. It means you need to if that's how you want to get there, sure, go ahead and study those things. But you have to be reading. You have to be absorbing other people's creativity and looking at good storytelling from other sources, because that's really going to teach you how to do this. And then you need to have an editor, because we all need an editor. Even at this stage in our careers, we need editors.
Absolutely. And I would add, I'm not classically trained in any sort of way. So my learning was strictly from books and Writer's Digest and reading as much as I could. And I would make sure that I bought my books and I read with colored pencils beside me. And I would highlight certain areas and make notes in the margin. This is flashback, or this is how you close quotes, or this is too long and this whole section slowed everything down and I had to go back 5 pages to figure out where we were again. So this was a mistake. This was, and I would find out later, that's called an info dump. So my teaching was all self-learned and done the hard way. And I didn't have the benefit of a really good developmental editor. My first editor was his first year. I was his first purchase. He was a junior editor. Yeah. And the editing process was painful and poor. And I'm grateful that he bought my first book, which was co-authored with Gary Leveille, who was a cop at the time. And we wrote together under the name Gary Hunter. But it was a painful experience in terms of a learning process, because basically all I learned was how to say no without coming across as a terrible human being. And no, I'm not going to do that. Here's what has to be done. And so I learned by seeing the mistakes that were being built into the project that Gary and I turned in. And that's really sad. But the benefit was, having learned all of that, when I did get my first good developmental editor writing as Gwen Hunter, it was mind-blowing. And I already had 2 steps up the ladder, having gone through a bad editorial process. And it was really wonderful to have, at that point in my career, 3rd book, someone who knew what they were doing and had been doing it for a long time. And she was wonderful. She took me from, like David said, took me from, here's how we can make this more difficult on your character. Here's how we can make this darker. Or you floundered here and you need to move this part of the conflict 40 pages forward and your solution 40 pages back. And so having that developmental editor was a real true gift. It really was. And I will agree. Now, David might want to also add, there's all different kinds of editors. There's developmental editors, copy editors, line editors, and some people that advertise online as being editors aren't developmental editors. And so that's a pretty important thing for young writers just starting out, to understand that there's a difference and to know what they're looking for if they are hiring an editor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's all kinds of editors, and frankly, finding good developmental editors in the marketplace is I would say very nearly impossible. You can find really good copy editors, people who can clean up your prose and help you sort out clarity in scenes and such. But if you're looking for that meta advice, how to deepen and improve a character, or how to take your conflict from the level of being compelling to the level of being absolutely gripping, those folks are hard to find. We used to find them in traditional publishing because they were hired by the publishers and they were provided to us. We didn't have to go out and find them. We were assigned to one when we started working. And that was the model, and that's what we were used to. In this new model of self-pubbing and indie pubbing, it's harder and harder to find that sort of feedback. And that is to the detriment of all the fiction that's being produced now. Because as I say, even the best writers, even the most experienced writers, still need editorial advice, and not just at a line editing level, but also at a storytelling level, because we all get so involved in the stories we write that finding the flaws is really hard. You have to be able to step so far outside of your own creative experience to look critically at the work you've produced that it becomes, it's almost impossible to do. You need to have a set of eyes. And so the people I turn to now tend to be people like Faith, and H.A. Hartley and other friends of mine who will read my books and look at them and say, okay, here are the problems I've got with what you did here. These are things you should think about as you further refine your storytelling.
That sounds like you've turned to the beta reader system.
Exactly. That's exactly right, because the developmental editor system has kind of broken down.
And also the ones that are still available, the two traditionally published writers like me, they're doing multiple books more than they used to have to do. They might have to do 3 times the books, edit 3 times the books today that they had edited 30 years ago had they been in their jobs then. So the time that they can spend on each project is less. I have for the Jane Yellowrock and the Soulwood series, I have an editor on the West Coast that I pay to help me with the early developmental problems, and she keeps track of timelines, and she keeps track of character histories, and she keeps track of which characters I've killed off so that I don't, like I did once, bring a character back to life 3 times. So yeah, I'm paying someone. I pay her to do this. I don't ask her to do this for free. And for the young writer out there, this can be an expensive process to get someone early on to help. Now, my editor at Penguin Random House is fabulous. She does not stint on my work. I don't mean to imply that. But I recognize that at 14 books in and 7 books into a series, I have to have a different viewpoint that is strictly related to the timelines of my novels that I don't catch, the things that I don't catch, and that this editor who's so busy in New York, it's not her job to catch them. It's her job to develop this book, not the 14, 15 book storyline that I'm working on.
Right. Plus, especially with today's workload, we can't go to a developmental editor at a publishing house who we're working with and say, can you look at this draft for me, and then I'll refine it more. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. You write a book and then you turn it in and you get one shot at having the developmental editor work on your book. They just don't have the time to help along the way. And we can't expect that of them. And that's one of the things that beta readers and friends who are writers are really helpful for.
And this is absolutely true. My first few novels, the editor would read a first draft and help me with the developmental parts. Now, I can't ask that of my editor. She doesn't have time to do that. I have to turn in a plot line polished novel. Now, it may still need a lot of developmental work, but the plot has to be fixed. There can't be plot holes. There can't be backward moving prose. It has to be structurally sound when I turn it in. And so the person that I've hired keeps a database. I think the last time she talked to me about Jane's database, it was 600 single spaced pages.
Jeez.
So the database is really, really long. And I can contact her and say, okay, I've done this, or I've written 100 pages and I've got green highlights all over the place. I need you to double check for me. And she will do we work in 100-page segments. She gives me her feedback on the first 100 pages, and then she gives me her feedback on the first 200 pages. After I've fixed those first 100 pages, I've written another 100. And so she's worth every dime I pay her to do it, because it saves my editor in New York a hassle. I don't want my editor in New York to think that I'm a pain in the butt and working with me is horrible because I turn in something that doesn't follow the timeline properly. So I desperately need that, what you're calling beta reading, but is actually professional beta reading. And there's a little bit of difference between having your fans beta read, which I don't deny is a wonderful help, but there's a difference between having a fan beta read versus having a published writer, a traditionally trained developmental editor, look at your work and address issues early on.
I'll actually just kind of go in, because I'm a beta reader for Brandon Sanderson, so I'm familiar with his process. And I know he also has an army of full-time assistants that he has, the person who keeps his timeline, that knows all of his timeline stuff. He has a person who's doing the alpha read. He has alpha readers, too, that are the professionals that are going through and doing the initial developmental edits.
That's what I pay one person for, and she gets a 1099 every year.
Can you guys talk about dealing with multiple projects at once in your process? Is that something you normally do? Is that more of an exception to the rule?
You know, I always say, oh no, I have to focus on one project at a time. And then I look at what I'm doing and it's like, yeah, you last focused on one project at a time in like 1998. You know, I am constantly working on more than one project. So in the first 3 months of this year, odd as this year has been, I have edited an anthology, written a nonfiction memoir piece that I'm hoping will be coming out sometime next year, revised the third book in my time travel epic fantasy series, and started working on this Thief Taker project that I'm working on now. I also, in that time, wrote a short story for one anthology and edited a short story for another anthology. Those both being my short stories and somebody else's anthology. So all of that stuff going on in the first 3 months of 2020.
And in the first 3 months of 2020 for me, starting in actually the last month in 2019, I was having physical health issues and I could not write. I had elder care issues, but I had a badly pinched nerve in my neck that would not allow me to turn my head or talk or use my right arm or type or anything else. And it took lots and lots of physical therapy and chiropractic and a lot of other, and steroids and help from my medical doctor to get me back to the point where I could be productive at all. So the only thing I did in the first 3 months of this year was turn down projects because I didn't know how productive I would be able to be or how well I would ever be again, and edit one project. That's it. That's all I got done. And it was, I have to say, it was the most miserable experience simply because I didn't know if I was going to have to find a new way to write. And I don't write well talking. So the voice to text stuff, that's not the way my brain works. And I would have had to learn a new way to write, which I've done before. I mean, I've been close to here before, but it would have meant something that I didn't want to do. And it would have meant a whole new process. So I was very grateful when I got the use of my arm back and the pain under control and was able to go forward. So every year is different. Every project time is different. In 2014, I wrote 2 novels, 2 novellas, and 5 short stories in 1 year. And I hated every minute of it. I did too much. So I went from, say, 2014 doing way too much to this year not turning in much until the pandemic hit, and suddenly I'm very productive. And that goes back to that young person who hid from the world and her own emotional issues in the tales of other people's writing or writing my own.
So, Faith, would you say that you prefer to just kind of do things linearly, or do you tend to find yourself kind of juggling between multiple projects?
When I was doing the year that I did so much, I always had multiple projects going, and I hated it. I hated it. This year, I've turned down so much that I'm just doing the one project, and it has been a lovely experience for me. It really has. I edited a book. I'm writing a book. I have a novella to write when I am finished with this book. I'm able to move forward at a pace that is comfortable for me right now. And I don't think I'll ever take on as many writing projects as I did in 2014. I don't like the mixing of things. I can do it. I did it, but I don't like doing it. And until I can afford to do what some people do and hire 50 people to help me, I've got my one helper.
Yeah.
And I've got a beta reader who helps me with the nail books on I forgot to mention her. She helps me with the nail books on the plant stuff and the genetic stuff. So I do have beta readers, but mostly I just want to work on one project at a time now, if I can. That's what I want to do. That's my preference.
You have to understand, I am much, much, much younger than Faith, and I don't get addled as easily as she does.
I'm sorry. Breaking up, there was some serious static.
I'm going to beat you with my cane next time I see you. Behave yourself. Really, it was a rough first 3 months of this year, and I feel like I'm just now back on track. And of course, the pandemic hits, and I'm missing my cons. I'm missing my friends. I'm missing. I'm still not 100% healthy in terms of the things that I can do, but I'm getting there, and I know that I will, assuming that, I survived the pandemic, I know that I will be in a position to hopefully do more, but I'm never going to go back to what I did in 2014. I'll never go back to doing that many projects in 1 year.
Faith, I know you have the wonderfully humorous Beast page, where you're getting to have a bit of a creative outlet there. And how do you feel it is helping? How's that kind of working into the whole the writing process for you?
Keeping Beast active on Beast pages for the fans, really and truly, they want to talk to Beast. Beast is way more popular than I am, and so this is PR. This is Beast interacting with Beast fans, and Beast has a following, and it's Beast is not prey on Facebook. If anyone wants to go like it and check it out, and Beast is her own person. She is the one character that I cannot keep in line. She has her own world. She has her own way of thinking, and the other characters, like say, no, you can't do that. That's not correct for you. And Beast is like, yeah, it is. Leave me alone. And Beast goes and does Beast things. So this is truly for the fans. It's not so much creative for me as it's Beast coming out of me. And boy, did that just sound scary.
Do you have any, David, do you have anything that you do to sometimes to vent creativity or to just dabble on the side?
Well, I've been actually, this year I had gotten away from blogging because I didn't have time or energy for it. And this year I have made a concerted effort to blog 3 times a week, every single week. I do a Monday post that's kind of about whatever is on my mind. I do a Wednesday writing tip post, and then I do a Friday photography post where I post a photo from one of my hikes during the course of the week. And I have found doing this I haven't gotten to the point where I dread it yet, because sometimes you take on a requirement like that or an assignment like that, and you feel like, oh, it's a burden and all that. I'm loving it. Every week I have stuff I want to write about. Every week I have advice I want to offer. Every week I have new photos that I want to show. And it's been really fun.
So I guess we can kind of go to closing statements. Anything that you kind of feel that people really need to hear about the writing process that you see especially when you go to cons and you're talking to younger writers? Is there something that like a piece of advice you feel you keep giving out that you'd like to put into posterity?
Well, actually, the thing I would say, and it relates to the last question we were talking about, and I mentioned that I had been writing, that I had worked on a nonfiction piece. Sometimes we writers, we spend a lot of time figuring out what's the thing we're going to sell next. What is the next step in our business plan for what we do? And sometimes we have to write not for what the business plan calls for, but for what our emotions call for. The nonfiction piece I wrote was about my brother who died a couple of years ago. And I had gotten to, late in the fall of 2019, I'd gotten to a really dark place. And I didn't realize just how dark it was until I had a couple of, those moments when your thoughts just take a turn that makes you just go, whoa, where in all the darkness that I have dealt with in my life, where did that come from? Because it was so far beyond any sort of level of depression or kind of acknowledgement of trauma that I had ever felt or dealt with before. And I wrote this piece because I understood that I was not being as productive as I would have liked, and I was not getting as much out of my writing as I would have liked because I had this residual grief holding me down. And writing the piece about my brother, which I'm very proud of it, and I really do look forward to the day when it's released because I think it's the best thing I've ever written in any genre or type of writing. But just getting it out, getting those words on the page lightened my life, lightened my emotions, allowed me to move on to a place where I no longer worry about my sanity the way I was worrying at the end of this last calendar year. And so sometimes I guess that would be the piece of advice I would give is write what you want to write, and certainly, write with a professional sense of where you want your career to go, but also understand that at times we just have to write because creativity is what we do, and it's how we process emotion and trauma and grief and also joy and epiphany and all the other things that make up our emotional lives.
I would so echo that. And I would add to it that what we've been saying this whole time is there's not just one way, just one process, just one anything. It is every single project has its own life to it. And you nurture that life and you build that life and you create this experience that a reader can fall into, this experiential, well, we want it to be a masterpiece, so let's just say it, this experiential masterpiece is what we hope we're writing. And when we get to the end of it, each one's different from the one before. Each process is different from the time before. Now, and it may not be substantially different, but the way we approached it is different. When my father had his stroke and then passed away 6 months later, my grief process was very different from David's. And but I still didn't deal with it outside of the writing. I dealt with it inside of the writing. And if I ever go back and read the books that were written then in that year-long, it was 6 months, but the grief went on, for the rest of that year. So that year-long time period, if I ever reread them, I will be able to pick out how I dealt with that experience and those emotions in the writing. I know it's there. I felt it come pouring out of me when I was working. So yes, we have to write with our heart and with our soul and with our pain and with our joy. And when it becomes writing just to clickety-clack words on the page, we as writers die a little bit. A.J. Hartley went through a difficult experience, the shooting at the college in Charlotte. David, do you remember the name of the school? I'm gone blank.
It's UNC Charlotte, University of North Carolina at Charlotte.
Yes, there was a shooting on campus, and he processed that by writing the novel Impervious, which is coming out, I think, in a couple of weeks. And that was a completely different process from anything he had done before, because he was processing all of his own emotions and his own reaction to that trauma, and he was churning it out through the creative process. And so we have to, we as writers, we pour this out. We pour our lives on paper, and maybe no one else would pick it up, that this is what Faith wrote when she was going through such and such a thing. But I can look back and I can see in my life how I was processing my emotional experiences when I wrote this trilogy or that standalone. And it is, being a writer is being human. Being creative is being human, and it comes out in our work. So, or young writers, just find a process that works for you. One thing I will say, stop looking back, stop fixing the mistakes, and finish the freaking book. That's the advice I would give people. Finish the book. You can fix anything. It's not like you're chiseling it in stone. Finish your novel.
All right. Well, thank you guys. This has been fun.
Thank you so much for coming and giving us a little bit of content to help us pretend that con season isn't completely gone, and help some of our attendees whet the appetite.
Can't wait to be able to see you guys in person at a convention sometime when we get there. Yeah.
Yes, and at my extremely advanced age, that may be longer than the rest of you.
So not touching that.
Nope, not touching it. So this has been JordanCONline, the writing process, with Faith Hunter and David Coe. I am Richard Fife, assisted with my assistant director, Robby Hilliard. All of you stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you on the other side of this. Thank you much.